Beverly Hills, November 1971. The Beverly Hills Hotel's crystal ballroom glowed under magnificent chandeliers as the entertainment industry's most distinguished figures gathered for the annual Comedy Veterans Dinner. 380 of Hollywood's most respected names filled every table, from vaudeville survivors to television's newest innovators, all assembled to honor the evolution of American comedy. At table 22 sat Dick Van Dyke, relaxed and genuine in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, that infectious smile lighting up conversations with Carol Burnett, Tim Conway, and Don Knotts as they discussed the changing landscape of television entertainment. The evening should have been pure celebration for Dick. His post-Dick Van Dyke Show career was flourishing with new projects, his influence on television comedy was undeniable, and he had become the standard by which all family entertainment was measured. But at the head table, puffing on his signature cigar like a wise oracle dispensing judgment, sat George Burns. George was comedy aristocracy in 1971, a performer whose career spanned every era of American entertainment, from vaudeville stages to radio airwaves, from nightclub circuits to television screens. George Burns had conquered them all with his deadpan delivery, perfect timing, and razor-sharp wit. At 75, he was the undisputed elder statesman of comedy, someone whose opinions carried the weight of 5 decades in show business. But George was also a man whose enormous ego had calcified alongside his legendary status. He'd grown accustomed to being treated as the final authority on all matters related to entertainment, and lately he'd been watching Dick Van Dyke's continued success with growing irritation wrapped in condescending amusement. If you've ever watched someone dismiss younger people's achievements just because of their age, you know exactly how George was feeling that night. The problem wasn't just Dick's ongoing success. It was the way people talked about that success. Critics were calling Dick insightful, sophisticated, a master of his craft. They were suggesting that Dick understood comedy on levels that previous generations hadn't reached. To George's mind, this was both insulting and absurd. Real comedy wisdom came from decades of hard-earned experience, not from a few years of television success. George had been nursing his trademark martini throughout the elegant dinner, his famous wit sharpened by alcohol and the growing conviction that someone needed to put this television golden boy in his proper place. He'd been listening to conversations about innovation in comedy, about how television was creating new possibilities, about how performers like Dick Van Dyke were pushing the medium into uncharted territories. Dick, meanwhile, was genuinely honored to be among comedy legends. He felt humbled by the company, grateful for the recognition, and eager to learn from performers who'd paved the way. When people mentioned George Burns, Dick spoke with enormous respect about the older comedian's contributions to American entertainment, about how George had shown that longevity in comedy came from constantly evolving while maintaining your essential character. But George interpreted Dick's presence and praise differently. What George saw was a naive television performer who thought a few years of success qualified him to sit at the table with real comedy legends. Someone who was being celebrated for innovation, when he was really just benefiting from technologies and opportunities that George's generation had never had. The formal program began at 9 o'clock with tributes to various comedy pioneers. Jack Benny was remembered posthumously, Milton Berle received thunderous applause, and the atmosphere remained warm and reverent. When Dick was called to present the Innovation in Comedy Award, the applause was genuine and enthusiastic. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dick began, his voice carrying easily through the elegant ballroom, "tonight we're celebrating something remarkable, the continuous evolution of American comedy across generations, mediums, and changing audiences." He paused, looking around at faces that represented the entire history of American entertainment. Comedy has always required 2 things: understanding your audience and understanding yourself. When I watch George Burns perform, I see both of those qualities perfected through decades of experience. George has entertained audiences across every medium that's ever existed, adapting his approach while maintaining the essential honesty that makes comedy work. The moment you hear genuine respect in someone's voice, You can feel it in the room. And everyone could feel Dick's sincerity. Dick's speech was generous and humble, acknowledging the foundation laid by established comedy legends. The beautiful thing about comedy, Dick continued, is that each generation learns from the masters who came before while finding their own voice for their own time. George Burns taught us that the secret to longevity isn't changing who you are. It's learning new ways to be yourself authentically. George's table had gone quiet. Several people glanced at him, trying to gauge his reaction to being mentioned with such obvious admiration. What I've learned from legends like George Burns, Dick concluded, is that real comedy wisdom comes from experience. But that experience is only valuable if you're willing to keep learning, keep growing, and keep connecting with new generations of audiences who need to laugh just as much as the generations before them. Dick received warm applause and returned to his table as the evening continued. But George's mood had shifted considerably. Being mentioned in Dick's speech felt patronizing to him, as if this television newcomer was graciously acknowledging the old masters while implying that he'd somehow surpassed them through modern sophistication. As the formal program neared its conclusion with George scheduled to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award, his carefully maintained persona of wise old comedian began to reveal sharper edges. When he took the microphone, there was an unmistakable edge to his demeanor that his closest friends recognized as dangerous. "Ladies and gentlemen," George began, his voice carrying that distinctive dry delivery that had made him famous. "I want to talk about what real comedy wisdom actually looks like, because I think we've gotten a little confused about that in all our excitement about television and modern approaches. If you've ever heard someone use the phrase, 'in my day,' with a certain tone, you knew exactly where this was heading." The room settled into attentive silence. This was George Burns, the master of deadpan comedy, about to share insights from 7 decades in entertainment. "Real comedy wisdom," George continued, "isn't learned in a few years of television success with professional writers and controlled studio conditions. Real comedy wisdom comes from surviving every possible audience, every possible medium, every possible challenge that show business can throw at you." Several people nodded, expecting this to be a thoughtful reflection on the accumulation of professional knowledge. "I've been performing for 70 years, George said, his voice taking on that edge that made his comedy cutting. "I've worked vaudeville houses where they threw vegetables, radio shows where you had one chance to get the laugh, nightclubs where the mob decided whether you worked again, and television when it was live, and there were no do-overs." George took a long puff of his cigar, letting the smoke create dramatic effect. "And I did it all without the safety net of multiple takes, script doctors standing by to fix my mistakes, or producers who could edit out the parts that didn't work. That's how you learn real comedy wisdom. That's how you earn the right to be called a master." The atmosphere in the Crystal Ballroom was beginning to shift as people sensed this was heading beyond nostalgic reflection. "Now, I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings," George continued, though his tone suggested otherwise, "but I think it's important that we maintain some perspective about what genuine comedy mastery actually looks like versus what just happens to work well in the comfortable world of television." George looked directly toward Dick's table, his eyes twinkling with what might have been mischief or malice. "Take Dick Van Dyke, for example," George said, his voice carrying that perfectly timed delivery that could make any observation sound like profound wisdom. "Everyone's calling him a comedy master, talking about his insights, celebrating his understanding of the craft." The ballroom went completely silent. 380 people stopped breathing as they realized they were about to witness something unprecedented. "But let's be honest about what Dick Van Dyke actually represents," George continued, his voice getting drier and more cutting. "Dick is a naive TV boy. He's someone who learned comedy in the controlled environment of television studios and thinks that qualifies him to understand the real entertainment business. Have you ever felt the exact moment when a room's energy completely changes? That's what happened next." Dick's face remained composed, but something in his posture was beginning to shift. Has Dick Van Dyke ever had to make audiences laugh when they came to see someone else? George asked rhetorically, Has he ever had to win over crowds who were actively hostile? Has he ever had to prove his comedy skills in situations where failure meant not eating that week? George's voice was getting more theatrical, more condescending. The answer is no. Dick Van Dyke has worked in the comfortable world of television production, where everything is designed to make him look good. He's never been tested under real show business conditions. He's just been lucky enough to work in a medium that protects performers from the harsh realities that real comedians have to face. The tension in the room was becoming palpable. This wasn't friendly ribbing anymore. This was something much more pointed. Dick Van Dyke's success is very impressive for television, George said with dismissive amusement. But that's not the same as understanding real show business. Real show business wisdom comes from surviving every possible challenge. Television success just means you're good at one very specific, very protected form of entertainment. George looked directly at Dick, his cigar creating a small cloud of smoke. So when I hear people calling Dick wise beyond his years, when I see him being treated like he understands the comedy business, I have to speak up. Because real wisdom comes from real experience under real pressure. And Dick Van Dyke is just a naive TV boy who thinks a few years of television success makes him an expert on entertainment. The silence that followed was unlike anything anyone in the Crystal Ballroom had ever experienced. 380 people held their breath, waiting to see how Dick Van Dyke would respond to this devastating public dismissal from one of comedy's most respected elders. If you're wondering what you would do in that situation, you're about to find out exactly how real strength responds to condescension. Dick stood up slowly, his movement deliberate and calm. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly through the silent room. "George," Dick said simply, "are you finished?" "I'm finished when someone acknowledges the difference between real show business wisdom and just being successful in television's protective environment," George replied, his voice still carrying that distinctive confidence. Dick walked to the center of the room, positioning himself where everyone could see him clearly. His movement was confident, unhurried, like a man who knew exactly what he intended to say. "All right," Dick said, his voice growing stronger. "Let's talk about real show business wisdom versus using that wisdom to exploit people. Let's talk about what it means to survive in entertainment versus what it means to survive by destroying others. And let's talk about the difference between being experienced and being cruel." You could feel the shift in the room's energy as people realized this wasn't going to be a simple defense. George's confident expression flickered slightly, but he maintained his pose of wise elder dispensing judgment. "George, you called me a naive TV boy," Dick continued. "You suggested that I don't understand real show business, that I've been protected from the harsh realities that real comedians face, that television success doesn't equal genuine wisdom about entertainment." Dick looked around the room, making eye contact with various entertainment legends. "Those are serious accusations, and I think everyone here deserves to understand what they really mean." Dick turned back to George, his voice becoming more pointed. "First, let's talk about what real show business wisdom actually requires. You're absolutely right that surviving different audiences, different mediums, and different challenges teaches valuable lessons. The ability to adapt, to read crowds, to handle rejection. Those are important skills." Several people in the audience began nodding, appreciating the measured response. "But George, wisdom isn't just about what you've survived. It's about how you've chosen to use what you've learned. And I think it's time we talked about the difference between surviving show business and using show business to exploit others." The room was completely focused on Dick now, sensing that something significant was about to be revealed. "You want to talk about real show business experience and the harsh realities of entertainment? Let's talk about it. Let's talk about what happened during your partnership with Gracie Allen." George's face began to change color, his cigar frozen halfway to his mouth. "Tell them about the contract negotiations in 1958, George," Dick said quietly. Several people in the audience leaned forward, clearly recognizing this reference but unsure of the details. Have you ever watched someone's entire demeanor change when their secrets are about to be exposed? That's what was happening to George Burns. "No," You don't want to tell them? Dick asked. Then I will. Dick turned to address the room. In 1958, when George and Gracie were renegotiating their television contracts, the network wanted to give them equal billing and equal pay for the first time in their 30-year partnership. Dick's voice was getting harder now. Gracie Allen had been the comedic genius of the Burns and Allen team for 3 decades. She was the one audiences loved, the one who got the laughs, the one who made the act work. But George had always maintained control of their business arrangements, keeping Gracie in a subordinate position financially despite her being the real star. Audible gasps came from several people in the audience. So when the network offered equal partnership, Dick continued, his voice getting more passionate. George told them that would be impossible because Gracie didn't understand businesses and needed to be protected from the complexities of show business finances. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. But that wasn't the worst part, George, Dick continued, his voice getting louder and more commanding. The worst part was what you told Gracie when she asked why she couldn't have equal billing after 30 years of being the star of your act. If you've ever seen someone's carefully constructed image crumble in real time, you were watching it happen to George Burns. Dick walked closer to George. You told her that audiences wouldn't respect a woman who seemed to be in charge, that the act needed a strong male presence to be taken seriously, and that she should be grateful for the success you had allowed her to achieve. The room was absolutely riveted. Gracie Allen, one of the most naturally gifted comedians who ever lived, was told by her partner of 30 years that she wasn't capable of understanding her own career, that she needed a man to make decisions for her, and that her contributions were less valuable than yours, despite the fact that she was clearly the more talented performer. Dick paused, letting his words sink in. You want to know how I found out about this, George? Because Gracie told my wife about it in 1960, 2 years before she died. She said it was one of the most hurtful conversations of her professional life, being told by someone she trusted that she wasn't smart enough or valuable enough to be treated as an equal partner. Dick looked around the room one final time. You called me naive about show business, George. But the real difference between us isn't experience, it's integrity. I've learned that real wisdom means lifting up your partners, not keeping them down to protect your own position. The silence that followed was deafening. George Burns stood there, his face a mixture of rage, humiliation, and something that might have been recognition of the truth. Then something happened that no one in the crystal ballroom expected. George's legs buckled, and he dropped to his knees. At first, people thought he was having some kind of medical episode. Several people moved to help him, but then they realized what was happening. George Burns, the wise elder of comedy, was kneeling, deliberately, in front of Dick Van Dyke, in front of 380 people. If you've ever wondered what accountability looks like when someone finally faces the truth about themselves, you were witnessing it in that moment. You're right, George whispered, his voice barely audible, his cigar forgotten on the floor beside him. Dick looked down at this legendary figure on his knees. This man who had entertained generations of people, now reduced to someone confronting his own failures as a partner and human being. George, Dick said gently, get up. I can't, George said, tears beginning to show in his eyes. I can't get up. What I did to Gracie, keeping her from getting what she earned, making her feel like she wasn't smart enough to understand her own success, I never thought about how my control was destroying her confidence. Yes, you did, Dick said quietly. You knew exactly what you were doing. But George, that doesn't mean you can't choose to honor her memory better. Dick knelt down beside George, bringing himself to eye level. The question isn't whether you took advantage of Gracie's trust, Dick said. The question is what you're going to do to make sure other women in this business are treated with the respect Gracie deserved. George looked at Dick through his emotional confusion. How can I fix this? How can I make it right when she's gone? How can I honor what she contributed when I spent so many years minimizing it? You start by telling the truth about who she really was, Dick said. You stop taking credit for her genius and start giving her the recognition she always deserved. You use whatever influence you have left to make sure other women in comedy get the respect and equality that Gracie never received. George nodded shakily. I will. I swear I will. Don't swear to me, Dick said. Swear to Gracie's memory. Swear to every woman in comedy who's been told she's not smart enough or valuable enough to be treated as an equal partner. Dick helped George to his feet. The room watched in amazement as the two comedians stood facing each other. Gracie was the genius, George said, his voice stronger but filled with regret. She was always the genius. I couldn't admit it because I was afraid of what that meant about me. The applause that followed was unlike anything the Crystal Ballroom had ever heard. It wasn't just appreciation for entertainment. It was recognition of genuine human transformation and long overdue acknowledgement of truth. George turned to address the room, his voice shaking but clear. Ladies and gentlemen, I owe you all an enormous apology. I owe Dick Van Dyke an enormous apology. And I owe the memory of Gracie Allen the biggest apology of my life. George's voice got stronger as he continued. I came here tonight thinking I was defending the wisdom that comes from experience, but I was really just protecting my own ego, my own fear of admitting that the most talented person in my act was never me. Dick Van Dyke doesn't need my permission to be wise. His actions tonight proved he understands things about integrity and partnership that I've spent 70 years avoiding. George looked directly at Dick. You're not a naive TV boy. You're someone who understands what I never learned, that real wisdom means acknowledging other people's contributions, especially when those contributions are greater than your own. If you've ever experienced a moment when someone finally admits a truth they've been hiding for decades, you understand the power of what happened in that ballroom. Over the next several months, the story dominated entertainment news. But the real story wasn't about confrontation or humiliation. The real story was about justice, truth, and the possibility that even legendary performers could learn to share credit where credit was due. George did change his approach to discussing his partnership with Gracie. In interviews, he began acknowledging her as the creative genius of their team, admitting that he had been essentially the straight man to her brilliance for 30 years. He established the Gracie Allen Foundation for Women in Comedy, dedicated to supporting female comedians and ensuring they received equal recognition and compensation. Years later, when George Burns died in 1996 at age 100, Dick Van Dyke spoke at his memorial service about the transformation he'd witnessed. George Burns taught me that real wisdom isn't about how long you've been in the business. It's about being brave enough to admit when you've been wrong and spending whatever time you have left trying to make it right. The story of that night in 1971 became more than just an entertainment industry anecdote. It became a watershed moment for recognizing women's contributions to comedy and entertainment, proving that even the most revered partnerships needed to be examined for hidden inequities. Dick Van Dyke's calm response didn't just put George Burns on his knees, it helped him stand back up as someone willing to tell the truth about Gracie Allen's genius and his own role in minimizing it. That's the real power of standing up for justice. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is force someone to acknowledge the contributions of people who can no longer speak for themselves. If you've made it this far, you understand something important about integrity and partnership. The courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it challenges people you respect. That's what real character looks like. And if stories like this resonate with you, if you believe that truth and justice matter more than protecting comfortable lies, then you're exactly the kind of person who understands why these moments matter. Because accountability isn't just about the past, it's about creating a future where everyone gets the recognition they deserve. But the transformation that began that night at the Beverly Hills Hotel had consequences that reached far beyond the entertainment industry. George's acknowledgement of Gracie's genius became a catalyst for a broader conversation about recognition and partnership in show business that continues to this day. If you've ever wondered what it takes for someone to completely change their perspective after decades of thinking one way, you're about to see exactly how that process unfolds. 3 weeks after the confrontation, George made a decision that shocked both the entertainment industry and Gracie Allen's surviving family members. He contacted Gracie's niece, Sandra Allen Morrison, and asked for a private meeting to discuss his treatment of Gracie during their partnership. "Mr. Burns called me out of the blue," Sandra later recalled in a 1975 interview. "He said he needed to talk to someone from Aunt Gracie's family about things he should have said while she was alive but never did. He sounded different than I'd ever heard him sound, vulnerable, almost broken." The meeting lasted 6 hours, with George listening as Sandra shared family stories about how Gracie had privately struggled with feeling undervalued despite her obvious talent and public success. George didn't make excuses or try to justify his past behavior. He simply absorbed the pain he had caused and asked what he could do to honor Gracie's memory more appropriately. "Uncle George had always been the business brain of the partnership," Sandra explained. "But what I learned that day was that he had used that role to control not just the money, but the narrative about who contributed what to their success. Aunt Gracie knew she was funny, but he had convinced her that being funny wasn't the same as being valuable." That conversation led to George's most important decision in decades. Within 6 months, he had rewritten his will to establish the Gracie Allen Foundation for Women in Comedy, funded with the majority of his estate and dedicated to ensuring that female comedians received equal recognition, equal pay, and equal respect in an industry that had traditionally marginalized their contributions. But George didn't stop there. He began actively reaching out to comedy venues, television networks, and variety show producers, using his influence to create opportunities specifically for women comedians who might otherwise be overlooked. Have you ever seen someone use their final years to completely reverse the mistakes of their earlier life? That's exactly what George Burns chose to do. The Foundation's first major project was commissioning a comprehensive study of comedy partnerships throughout history, examining how credit and compensation had been distributed between male and female performers. The results were shocking even to industry veterans who thought they understood the scope of inequality in entertainment. "What we discovered," said Dr. Margaret Williams, the researcher who led the study, "was that in virtually every successful male-female comedy partnership of the 20th century, the woman was doing most of the creative work, while the man was receiving most of the credit and compensation. The Burns-Allen dynamic wasn't unique, it was the standard." The study's findings led to policy changes at major networks and production companies. New guidelines required equal billing and compensation for partnerships where both performers contributed substantially to the act's success, and historical partnerships were re-examined to ensure proper credit was given to previously under-recognized contributors. Dick Van Dyke's role in George's transformation didn't go unnoticed in Hollywood. His willingness to confront a legend about gender equity had earned him respect from women in the industry, who had long felt powerless to address such issues themselves. If you're someone who believes that standing up for others takes real courage, especially when those others can't stand up for themselves, then you understand why Dick's actions that night mattered so much. In 1973, 2 years after the Beverly Hills Hotel confrontation, George and Dick collaborated on a television special called Comedy Partnerships: The Truth About Teams. The show featured George honestly discussing his partnership with Gracie, acknowledging her as the creative genius while explaining how his own insecurities had led him to minimize her contributions. Working with George now is completely different from meeting him that first night. Dick told TV Guide during the special's production, "The person he's allowed himself to become is someone who finally understands that sharing credit doesn't diminish your own accomplishments. It makes them more meaningful." George's response revealed the depth of his transformation. "Dick saved my reputation by forcing me to confront what I was doing to it. I thought protecting my status meant taking more credit than I deserved. But real status comes from being honest about who made your success possible." The special was both a ratings success and a cultural touchstone, praised for its honest examination of how gender dynamics had affected comedy partnerships throughout entertainment history. More importantly, it inspired other male performers to examine their own partnerships and ensure they were giving appropriate credit to their female collaborators. George's later public appearances also evolved dramatically. Instead of solo performances designed to showcase his own wit, they became collaborative efforts featuring female comedians who shared billing and spoke as equals rather than opening acts. George positioned himself as a mentor and supporter rather than the sole attraction, using his platform to introduce audiences to emerging female talent. These collaborative shows proved more successful than his previous solo efforts, drawing larger audiences and receiving more positive reviews. Viewers particularly appreciated seeing the legendary George Burns in a supporting role, helping other comedians shine rather than demanding the spotlight for himself. When Gracie Allen was posthumously inducted into the Comedy Hall of Fame in 1985, George insisted on presenting the award himself. His speech that night became legendary, not just for its humor, but for its complete honesty about their partnership. "For 30 years, I stood next to the funniest person who ever lived," George told the audience, tears streaming down his face. "And for most of those 30 years, I let people think I was the reason we were successful. That was the greatest con job in show business history, because anyone who actually watched our act knew that Gracie was the genius." George looked at Gracie's portrait on the stage beside him. "I spent decades taking credit for her brilliance, and I spent my final 25 years trying to give her the recognition I should have given her from the beginning. If there's a lesson in my life, it's this: when you're lucky enough to work with someone more talented than you, your job isn't to hide their light, it's to help it shine brighter." If you've ever heard someone truly apologize for decades of wrongdoing, you understand the power of George's words that night. The audience gave Gracie's memory a standing ovation that lasted nearly 20 minutes, but what mattered more was the change in how comedy partnerships were discussed and structured in the years that followed. When George Burns died in 1996 at age 100, his memorial service featured dozens of female comedians whose careers he had supported after his transformation. Sandra Allen Morrison delivered a eulogy that captured the real lesson of that night in 1971. "George Burns made terrible mistakes in how he treated my aunt during their partnership. But then he spent 25 years proving that people can change, that men can learn to share credit appropriately, and that the most important thing about recognizing your mistakes is what you do after you realize you've made them." Sandra looked out at the audience of entertainment figures. Dick Van Dyke confronted George Burns about gender equity not because he wanted to destroy a legend, but because he wanted to save one. And in saving George, he saved the memory of Aunt Gracie and helped create opportunities for countless women who came after her. The story of George Burns calling Dick Van Dyke a naive TV boy had become one of entertainment's most important transformation narratives. It proved that even the most established, beloved, and powerful figures could learn to share credit more fairly when confronted with the consequences of their actions. More importantly, it demonstrated that accountability in entertainment didn't have to mean destruction. Dick's approach, presenting facts calmly, appealing to conscience, and offering the possibility of redemption, had created change that lasted for decades and influenced an entire industry's understanding of partnership and recognition. If you're still reading this story, it's probably because you recognize something important about justice, partnership, and the courage required to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. The Beverly Hills Hotel that night had witnessed more than just a confrontation between two comedians. It had witnessed the birth of a new understanding about how credit should be shared, how partnerships should be structured, and how legends should use their influence to lift up rather than minimize the contributions of others. And if you believe that stories like this matter, that accountability can lead to positive change, that standing up for what's right is always worth it even when it's difficult, then you understand exactly why Dick Van Dyke's courage that night created ripples that are still being felt today. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to let comfortable lies continue when the truth could set everyone free.